Imagine waking up one morning and your entire life is gone. Your job, your family, your freedom, all of it, stripped away in the span of a single night. No trial, no jury, no explanation. Just a knock on the door at 3 a.m. and men in uniforms telling you to get dressed. That's it. That's all you get. This happened to millions of people in the Soviet Union. Real people, ordinary people. Teachers, doctors, farmers, engineers, anyone could become a target. And once you were taken, most people never came back. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of one man who did. His name was Aleksandr Petrovich Volkov, and what he endured over the course of 4 brutal years inside Stalin's Gulag system is one of the most harrowing survival stories to ever come out of the Soviet Union. So sit down, get comfortable, and whatever you do, don't look away. Because this story, it's going to stay with you. To understand what happened to Aleksandr, you first need to understand the world he lived in. The year was 1937. Now, if that number sounds familiar, it should. 1937 is often referred to by historians as the single most terrifying year in Soviet history. And trust me, that's saying something, because the Soviet Union had plenty of terrifying years. What was happening in 1937? Stalin's Great Purge was in full swing. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Great Purge was a massive, state-sponsored campaign of political repression that swept across the entire Soviet Union. Stalin had become increasingly paranoid. He saw enemies everywhere. In the military, in the government, in the Communist Party itself. And so he decided to eliminate them. All of them. The problem? There weren't nearly as many enemies as Stalin believed there were. So the system started manufacturing them. Anyone could be accused. Anyone could be arrested. Sometimes it was because of a genuine political disagreement. Sometimes it was because a neighbor held a grudge. Sometimes, and this is the part that makes your blood run cold, it was completely random. Aleksandr Volkov was 34 years old at the time. He was an engineer living in Leningrad. He had a wife named Katya, a young daughter named Sonia, who was only 6. He worked for the state. He was, by all accounts, a loyal Soviet citizen. He did nothing wrong, and that didn't matter at all. It was a Tuesday night in October. Aleksandr was at home with his family. Katya was reading. Little Sonia had already gone to bed. It was quiet. It was ordinary. It was peaceful. And then, at 2:47 in the morning, there was a knock on the door. Not a polite knock, not a neighborly knock, a heavy knock, the kind of knock that changes everything. Aleksandr opened the door, and 3 men in NKVD uniforms, that's the Soviet secret police, were standing there. One of them held a piece of paper. He didn't read it out loud. He didn't explain what it said. He simply handed it to Aleksandr and said, "Get dressed, you're coming with us." That was it. No negotiation. No questions allowed. Aleksandr looked at the paper. His name was on it, along with a single word that would seal his fate. Enemy of the people. Now, here's what's so chilling about that label. Enemy of the people wasn't a specific crime. It wasn't tied to any particular action. It was a catch-all accusation, a bureaucratic death sentence dressed up in political language. You were an enemy of the people if the state said you were. End of discussion. Katya woke up during the commotion. She rushed into the room, still in her nightgown, and she begged. She pleaded with the officers to let her husband stay. She told them he was a good man, a loyal man, that there had to be a mistake. They didn't even look at her. Aleksandr turned to his wife one last time. He wanted to say something, anything, to comfort her. But what do you say in a moment like that? What words exist for something like this? He kissed her forehead. He whispered, "I'll come back." He walked out the door. He would not see his family again for years. What happened next to Aleksandr is what happened to almost everyone who got dragged out of their homes during the Great Purge. First, the interrogation. He was taken to an NKVD detention facility in Leningrad. And there, he was held in a small, freezing cell for days. No sunlight, barely any food. No information about what he was accused of or what would happen to him. The goal wasn't justice. The goal was to break him down. And then the interrogations began. Now, I want you to understand something about Soviet interrogations during this period. They weren't designed to find the truth. They were designed to produce confessions. The NKVD had quotas, actual numerical quotas, for how many people they needed to arrest and convict in a given region. So the interrogators didn't care whether Aleksandr had actually done anything wrong. They needed him to confess. And the methods they used to get that confession were absolutely brutal. Sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation, threats against his family, hours upon hours of relentless questioning where the same questions were asked over and over and over again, sometimes through the night, sometimes for multiple nights in a row. Aleksandr held out for weeks. He insisted he had done nothing. He insisted there was a mistake. He begged them to check, to verify, to see that he was just an ordinary man with an ordinary life. It didn't matter. After 3 weeks of interrogation, 3 weeks of almost no sleep, almost no food, and constant psychological torture, Aleksandr signed a confession. He admitted to being a spy. He admitted to plotting against the Soviet state. He admitted to crimes he had never committed, had never even thought about committing. He signed it because he had no choice. The trial lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes to decide the fate of a man's entire life. There was no defense attorney, no opportunity to present evidence, no chance to speak. The sentence was handed down without ceremony. 10 years in a corrective labor camp, 10 years in the Gulag. The journey from Leningrad to the Gulag camp where Aleksandr would spend his sentence was, in many ways, almost as brutal as the camp itself. He was loaded onto a cattle car, a freight train car with no seats, no heat, and no sanitation, along with dozens of other prisoners. Men, women, some of them elderly, all of them labeled as enemies of the state. The trip took weeks. Weeks of freezing temperatures, weeks of cramped, filthy conditions, weeks of eating almost nothing. The train would stop at various points along the way, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, with no explanation. Prisoners weren't told where they were going. They weren't told how long the journey would take. During this trip, Aleksandr watched people break down. He watched grown men weep. He watched an old woman in the corner of the car who simply stopped speaking, stopped eating, stopped responding to anything. She was dead before they reached their destination. No one knew her name. Aleksandr later said that this journey was the first time he truly understood what the Soviet state was capable of. Not in the abstract, not as a political concept, but personally, viscerally, in his own body. The destination was a camp called Solovetsk, located on a series of islands in the White Sea in the far north of Russia. If you look at a map, you'll find it sitting in one of the coldest, most remote, and most inhospitable regions on the planet. Winter temperatures could drop to -40 degrees Celsius. The nearest major city was hundreds of kilometers away. There was no road, no railway, nothing but ice, frozen forests, and the bitter, unforgiving Arctic wind. It was, in every sense of the word, the edge of the world, and for Aleksandr Volkov, it was about to become his prison. The moment Aleksandr stepped off the transport boat and onto the island, he knew something was fundamentally wrong. Not just with his situation, with everything. The camp was built around an old monastery, a place that had once been dedicated to prayer and peace. Now it was one of the most notorious detention facilities in the entire Soviet Union. The contrast between what it had been and what it had become was almost too cruel to process. The first thing that hit him was the cold, a cold so deep and so all-consuming that it didn't just chill his skin, it seemed to reach inside his chest and grip his lungs. He had never experienced anything like it. Nothing in his life in Leningrad had prepared him for this. The second thing that hit him was the smell. Thousands of bodies packed into spaces designed for far fewer. Sweat, filth, decay, the smell of sickness, the smell of despair, and the sound, the noise, hundreds of men shouting, crying, arguing, praying. All at once, all the time. It was chaos, pure, unfiltered chaos. Aleksandr was processed like livestock. His clothes were taken, his personal belongings, the few he had left, were confiscated. He was given a uniform that was too thin for the climate, a prisoner number, and a bunk in a barracks that was already overcrowded beyond capacity. And then, within hours of arriving, he was put to work. Let me be very clear about something. The Gulag was not a prison in the way most of us understand the word. It wasn't a place where you sat in a cell and waited out your sentence. It was a labor camp. And the labor was the whole point. The Soviet state used the Gulag system as a massive, forced labor operation. Prisoners were sent to the most remote, most dangerous, most difficult locations in the country, places where no one would willingly go, to extract resources, build infrastructure, and do the work that no free citizen would ever agree to do. At Solovetsk, the primary work was logging, every single day. Regardless of weather, regardless of temperature, regardless of health, prisoners were marched into the frozen forests and forced to cut down trees. The work was backbreaking. The tools were primitive, axes, saws, basic equipment that was often dull or broken. The quotas were brutal. Each prisoner was expected to produce a certain amount of lumber per day, and if you fell short of that quota, the consequences were immediate and severe. Less food, harder labor assignments, punishment, in some cases, isolation, being locked alone in a freezing shed for days with nothing but a bucket and whatever scraps of food the guards decided to throw in. Aleksandr threw himself into the work with everything he had, not because he wanted to, not because he believed in it, but because he understood, almost immediately, that survival in Solovetsk was not guaranteed. People died there. Every single day, they died from the cold, from exhaustion, from starvation, from disease, from accidents in the logging camps. A falling tree, a miscalculated cut, a moment of inattention born from weeks of sleep deprivation, and sometimes they simply gave up. They stopped eating, stopped working, stopped fighting. And they faded away, quietly and without ceremony, into the frozen landscape that had swallowed them whole. Aleksandr refused to be one of them. One of the things that made the Gulag so psychologically devastating, beyond the physical brutality, was the sheer diversity of the people trapped inside it. Aleksandr found himself surrounded by men from every possible background. Engineers like himself, academics, former military officers, priests, farmers, factory workers, Jews, Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Poles, people from dozens of different nationalities and walks of life, all united by the same label, enemy of the people. Some of them were genuinely political dissidents, men who had spoken out against the regime and paid the price for it. But most of them, like Aleksandr, had done absolutely nothing. One man Aleksandr befriended early on was a former professor named Dmitri. Dmitri had been a respected scholar of Russian literature before his arrest. He was intelligent, articulate, and deeply, quietly furious about what had been done to him and to the country. Dmitri became one of Aleksandr's closest companions during his time in the camp. The two of them would talk for hours, when they had the energy, about everything from philosophy to survival strategies to memories of the lives they had left behind. Dmitri taught Aleksandr something crucial during those early months: how to read the guards. Every guard had a personality. Some were sadistic, men who genuinely enjoyed inflicting pain and watching prisoners suffer. These were the ones you avoided at all costs. Others were indifferent. They did their job mechanically, without cruelty, but without compassion either. And a rare few, a very rare few, were almost human. They might look the other way when a prisoner smuggled an extra piece of bread. They might not report a minor infraction. Learning to tell the difference between these types of guards could literally save your life. Aleksandr absorbed every lesson Dmitri had to offer, and slowly, painfully, he began to adapt to the brutal rhythms of camp life. But adaptation is not the same as acceptance, and for Aleksandr, the breaking point came not during a particularly brutal day of labor, or during one of the camp's many violent confrontations between prisoners. It came quietly, privately, on a night when he was alone with his thoughts and the weight of everything he had lost finally became too heavy to bear. It was the winter of 1938, about 4 months into his sentence. He was lying on his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling above him. The barracks were dark. Around him, men were sleeping, or trying to. The cold was savage. His body ached from the day's work. His stomach was empty. And he thought about Sonia, his daughter, 6 years old, with her mother's eyes and his stubborn streak. He wondered if she even knew where he was. He wondered if Katya had been allowed to send a letter. He wondered if Sonia thought he was ever coming home. And in that moment, something inside him cracked. Not broke, cracked, like ice forming on a frozen lake, a hairline fracture that threatened to split everything apart. He pressed his face into the thin, filthy pillow beneath his head, and for the first time since his arrest, he wept. He wept silently, desperately, with his whole body shaking because crying out loud in a place like Solovetsk was a vulnerability you could not afford. When it was over, he lay there in the darkness, breathing, feeling the cold, feeling the emptiness, and then, somewhere deep inside himself, in a place he didn't even know existed, he found something, a flicker, small, fragile, but there. Resolve. I'm going to survive this. I'm going to see my daughter again, and nothing is going to stop me. It was not a grand declaration. It was not heroic. It was simply a decision, a quiet, private, desperate decision made in the dark by a man who had nothing left except the will to keep breathing. And that decision, more than anything else, is what kept Aleksandr Volkov alive. Surviving the Gulag was not about strength alone. It wasn't about being the toughest, the fastest, or the most physically capable man in the camp. It was about intelligence, about reading situations, about knowing when to fight and when to stay invisible. Over the months that followed, Aleksandr developed a survival system, a set of unwritten rules that he followed religiously every single day. The first rule was simple: never stand out. In the Gulag, standing out was dangerous. If you drew attention to yourself, whether by speaking too loudly, by complaining, by refusing an order, or by appearing too healthy or too well-fed, you became a target, either for the guards or for other prisoners who might see you as a threat or a resource. Aleksandr learned to move through the camp like a shadow, quiet, unremarkable, invisible. The second rule was equally important. Never trust completely, but never stop trusting entirely. The Gulag was a place where betrayal was constant. Prisoners informed on each other for extra food, for better assignments, sometimes simply to deflect suspicion from themselves. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed, but total isolation was equally deadly. You needed allies. You needed people who would watch your back, who would share information, who would help you when you were too sick or too exhausted to help yourself. The trick was finding the right balance, maintaining relationships without exposing yourself completely. Aleksandr was good at this, perhaps better than he realized. The third rule was about food. And in the Gulag, food was everything. The rations provided by the camp were barely enough to sustain life, let alone support the brutal physical labor prisoners were forced to perform. The bread was often stale or moldy. The soup was thin and tasteless. Meat was a rare luxury. So prisoners supplemented their diet however they could. Some foraged during work assignments, gathering berries or mushrooms from the forest floor. Others traded, Anything of value could be bartered for food. Information, favors, protection, all of it had a caloric equivalent. Aleksandr became skilled at this economy. He learned which guards could be bribed, which work assignments offered the best opportunities to forage, and how to ration his own portions to stretch them as far as possible. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dignified, but it kept him alive. If there is one thing that defined life in Solovetsk, one single element that shaped every moment of every day, it was the cold. Not the kind of cold you experience during a harsh winter in a temperate climate. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver and reach for an extra blanket. This was a cold that attacked you. A cold that felt alive, like something with intent, something that was actively trying to destroy you from the outside in. Temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. On the coldest days, and there were many, it fell to -40 or even lower. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes within minutes. Frostbite is not a risk, it is a certainty. The uniforms prisoners wore were criminally inadequate for the conditions. Thin cotton, no insulation, boots that were often cracked or falling apart. In many cases, prisoners wrapped rags around their feet and hands just to maintain basic feeling in their extremities. And still, they were sent outside to work, every single day. Aleksandr watched men lose fingers to frostbite. He watched men collapse during work assignments, their bodies simply shutting down from the cold, and be left where they fell while the rest of the prisoners continued cutting trees. He watched a man named Pavel, a kind, gentle soul who had been a school teacher before his arrest, develop a cough during the first brutal winter that never went away. It deepened over the weeks, turned into pneumonia, and by spring, Pavel was dead. He was 41 years old. Aleksandr attended no funeral. There were no funerals in Solovetsk. The dead were buried in mass graves, or sometimes, when the ground was too frozen to dig, simply left outside until the thaw. The cold took people quietly and without mercy, and every winter the camp grew a little emptier. The physical brutality of the Gulag was horrific, but in many ways the psychological toll was even worse. Because the body can heal, wounds close, bones mend. But the damage done to the mind, the constant fear, the helplessness, the grinding dehumanization, that leaves marks that never fully disappear. The guards used psychological tactics as deliberately as they used physical ones. They were designed to strip prisoners of their identity, their autonomy, and their sense of self-worth. You were not a person in Solovetsk. You were a number. You were addressed by your prisoner number, not your name, sir. You were told in countless ways, both explicit and subtle, that you were worthless, that you deserved what was happening to you, that the state had judged you and the state was always right. Some prisoners internalized this. They began to believe it. They lost the sense of who they had been before the camp. The husband, the father, the engineer, the man with dreams and hopes and a life that mattered. All of that was erased, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the prisoner. Aleksandr fought this with everything he had. Every night before he fell asleep, if he could fall asleep, he would run through his memories. Deliberately, intentionally. He would remember the smell of Katya's hair, the sound of Sonia's laughter, the view from the window of their apartment in Leningrad on a summer morning, the way the light hit the water along the Neva River. He did this not for comfort. He did it as an act of resistance, because as long as he could remember who he was, as long as those memories remained vivid and real, the camp had not won. Not completely. It was a small rebellion. But in a place where every form of resistance had been systematically crushed, it was the only one available to him, and he clung to it like a lifeline. By 1941, Aleksandr had been in Solovetsk for nearly 4 years. He had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. He had scars on his hands from the logging work. He had watched dozens of men die around him, from cold, from disease, from exhaustion, from despair. But he was still alive. And then, on June 22, 1941, everything changed. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Now you might be wondering, what did the war have to do with a prisoner in an Arctic labor camp? The answer is everything. The Nazi invasion threw the entire Soviet state into chaos. Suddenly, the resources, the manpower, the political will that had been dedicated to running and expanding the Gulag system were redirected toward the war effort. Camp conditions, which were already terrible, deteriorated dramatically. Food rations were cut even further. Guards who had been reassigned to the front left gaps in the camp's security. The infrastructure, already crumbling, began to fall apart more rapidly. But the war also created something else, something unexpected. It created opportunity, because in the chaos of wartime, the rigid, airtight control that the Soviet state had maintained over its prisoners began, very slightly, to loosen. Not much. Not enough to make escape easy. But enough, just barely enough, to make it possible. Alexander noticed this immediately. He had spent years studying the camp's routines, its weaknesses, its blind spots. He had mapped the guard rotations in his head. He knew which sections of the perimeter fence were less heavily watched. He knew the terrain surrounding the island, the forests, the shoreline, the patterns of the ice. And now, for the first time since his arrival, he began to think seriously about escape. Planning an escape from a Soviet gulag was not something you did alone. It was not something you did quickly, and it was not something you did carelessly. A single mistake could mean death, not just your own, but the death of everyone involved. Alexander spent months laying the groundwork, quietly, patiently, with the same careful, methodical thinking that had made him a good engineer. He identified 3 other prisoners who he believed he could trust. Men he had observed closely over years, men whose character he understood, men who had as much to lose as he did, and as much reason to risk everything. One of them was Dmitri, his old friend and mentor. Dmitri was weakening. The years in the camp had taken a severe toll on his body, but his mind was sharp, and his desire to survive was fierce. The second was a man named Yuri, a former soldier who had been arrested on fabricated charges of treason. Yuri was physically strong, emotionally stable, and possessed of a quiet, dangerous competence that made him invaluable in a situation like this. The third was a younger man named Sergei, barely 25, who had been arrested simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time during a raid. Sergei was fast, adaptable, and, crucially, he had knowledge of the surrounding geography that none of the others possessed. Together, the 4 of them spent weeks meeting in stolen moments, during work assignments, during the brief periods when guards looked the other way, to discuss and refine their plan. The plan was simple in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. They would escape during a logging assignment, deep in the forest, when they were far enough from the main camp that their absence might not be noticed immediately. They would move at night, navigating by the stars and by Sergei's knowledge of the terrain. They would head south, away from the Arctic coast, toward the mainland, where they would try to blend into the chaos of wartime Russia and disappear. The biggest challenge was the first stage, getting off the island. Solovetsk was surrounded by water. In summer, it was open sea. In winter, the White Sea froze, but not completely and not uniformly. The ice was unpredictable. In some places it was thick enough to walk on. In others, it was thin enough to swallow a man whole. They would need to cross the ice, in the dead of winter, at night, with no map and no guarantee that the ice would hold. It was, by any reasonable measure, a plan with a very high probability of failure. But it was the only plan they had. The escape happened on a night in February 1942. The temperature was -35 degrees Celsius. The sky was clear, brutally, painfully clear, which meant the stars were visible, which meant navigation was possible, but it also meant there was no cloud cover to hide their movement. They went during a night shift change, a 40-minute window when the guards on the perimeter were transitioning and attention was at its lowest. Aleksandr moved first, then Yuri, then Sergei, then Dmitri, who was slower now, his body struggling with the cold and the years of deprivation, but who moved with a quiet determination that Aleksandr had always admired. They stayed low. They stayed silent. They moved through the trees at the edge of the camp like ghosts, each footfall calculated, each breath controlled. It took them 20 minutes to reach the shoreline, and then they stepped onto the ice. Now, I want you to imagine this moment, because it is the hinge point of this entire story. 4 men, standing on the edge of a frozen sea. Behind them, a prison camp where they would be executed if caught. In front of them, kilometers of ice of unknown thickness, in the pitch black of an Arctic night, with temperatures that could kill an exposed man in under an hour. There was no turning back. They walked. The ice groaned beneath their feet. It creaked and shifted with every step, and each sound sent a jolt of pure terror through Aleksandr's body. He kept his weight low, his steps wide, moving the way Sergei had instructed, spreading his body weight as evenly as possible across the surface. They moved in single file, slowly, deliberately, testing each step before committing to it. At one point, about halfway across, the ice beneath Yuri's foot gave way with a sharp crack, and his leg plunged through into the freezing water below. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and he made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a cry, that cut through the silence like a blade. Aleksandr grabbed him, pulled him back onto solid ice, held him still until his breathing steadied. They waited, listened. No alarm, no shouting from the camp behind them. They kept moving. It took them nearly 2 hours to cross. When Aleksandr's boots finally touched solid ground on the other side, the mainland, the frozen shore of the Russian continent, he did not celebrate. He did not feel relief. He felt nothing except the cold and the desperate, burning need to keep moving. Because they were not safe. Not yet, not even close. The days that followed the escape were, in many ways, harder than anything Aleksandr had endured inside the camp. At least in Solovetsk, there was structure. There was a routine. There were walls. There was food. Meager as it was. Out here, in the frozen wilderness of northern Russia, there was nothing. No shelter, no food, no path, no destination within reach. Just ice, and snow, and trees, and a cold so absolute that it felt like the world itself was trying to kill them. The 4 men moved south as quickly as they dared, traveling at night and hiding during the day in whatever cover the forest offered, beneath fallen trees, in shallow depressions in the snow, anywhere that provided even a small degree of concealment. They had brought almost nothing with them. A knife, a small amount of dried bread that Aleksandr had managed to smuggle from the camp over the course of weeks. A rough mental map that Sergei had pieced together from fragments of information gathered during work assignments. It was not enough. They all knew it was not enough. Hunger set in within the first 2 days. By the 3rd day, it was consuming. A physical, gnawing pain in the stomach that made it difficult to think, difficult to move, difficult to do anything except focus on the desperate need for food. They foraged. They set crude snares, fashioned from strips of cloth and wire, hoping to catch rabbits or other small animals. Sometimes they succeeded. More often, they did not. They melted snow for water, heating it in their hands, a process that was agonizingly slow and left their fingers raw and blistered. And they kept moving. Dmitri was struggling. His body, already weakened by years of camp life, was not equipped for this kind of sustained physical exertion in extreme cold. He slowed them down. He needed more rest. He fell behind. But Aleksandr refused to leave him. Every time Dmitri stumbled, Aleksandr was there. Every time Dmitri needed to stop, they all stopped. Every time the old professor's legs threatened to give out beneath him, Aleksandr put an arm around his shoulders and hauled him forward. "You are not dying out here, Dmitri," he told him more than once. "Not after everything we survived. Not now." It was not kindness, exactly. It was stubbornness. A refusal to accept defeat that had become the defining force of Alexander's character. On the 7th day of their escape, they encountered another human being for the first time. It was a woman, a peasant farmer, living alone in a small wooden house at the edge of a village, barely more than a collection of buildings huddled together against the cold. She saw them approaching through the trees, 4 gaunt, half-frozen men in prisoner uniforms, moving like shadows, and instead of turning them away, or reporting them, or doing any of the dozen things that would have been the safe, rational choice in Soviet Russia, she opened her door. She brought them inside. She fed them simple food, nothing more than bread and broth and a few withered vegetables. But it was warm, and it was sustenance, and to 4 men who had been surviving on scraps and melted snow for a week, it felt like salvation. Her name was Anna. She was in her 50s. Her husband had been taken by the war, drafted into the Red Army and never heard from again. She lived alone, grew what she could, and kept to herself. When Alexander told her where they had come from, when he told her they were escaped prisoners, she simply nodded. She didn't flinch. She didn't look at them with fear or disgust. She looked at them with recognition. "My brother was taken," she said quietly, 3 years ago. "They said he was an enemy. He wasn't. He was just there." She let them stay for 2 days. She gave them dry clothes, her late husband's, and patches for their boots. She told them which villages to avoid, which roads were patrolled, and which direction to go to reach the nearest railway line, where they might be able to blend into the flow of wartime refugees moving across the country. When they left, Alexander thanked her. He thanked her with everything he had, because he understood, perhaps better than anyone, what she had risked by helping them. In Stalin's Russia, harboring escaped prisoners was a crime punishable by imprisonment or death. She waved them off with a small, sad smile and turned back inside her house. Alexander never learned what happened to her after that. The journey from northern Russia back to something resembling civilization took months. Months of traveling by foot, by hitching rides on trucks and carts, by sneaking onto trains during the chaos of wartime movement. Months of hiding in barns, in forests, in abandoned buildings. Months of using false names, fabricated stories, and the general confusion of a nation at war to avoid detection. It was exhausting. It was terrifying. And at every turn, there was the ever-present risk of being caught, of being recognized as escaped prisoners and dragged back to the Gulag, or worse. But they kept moving. Yuri's military background proved invaluable during this phase. He knew how to move undetected. He knew how to read the landscape, how to assess risk, how to stay one step ahead of potential pursuers. His calm, steady presence was an anchor for the group during the most dangerous moments. Sergei, young and adaptable, proved remarkably good at blending in. He could talk his way through checkpoints, charm information out of strangers, and adapt to changing circumstances with a fluidity that kept them all alive more than once. And Dmitri, fragile, aging Dmitri, kept their spirits up. Even when his body was failing him, his mind remained sharp, his wit intact, his quiet observations about life and humanity and the absurdity of their situation cutting through the fear and exhaustion like a beam of light. Alexander held them all together, not through force or authority, but through the same quiet, stubborn resolve that had kept him alive in the camp. He set the pace, he made the decisions. He was the one who said, "We keep going," when every other instinct screamed to stop, to rest, to give up. Because giving up was not an option. Not anymore. Not after everything they had survived. Alexander reached Leningrad in the spring of 1942. The city was barely recognizable. The Nazi siege, which had begun the previous autumn, had transformed it into a wasteland of destruction and starvation. Buildings were bombed out, streets were empty, The population had been decimated by war, by hunger, by the brutal Russian winter. Finding Katya and Sonya was not easy. The city was in chaos. Records had been destroyed. People had been displaced, relocated, scattered across the country. It took weeks of searching, weeks of asking questions, following leads, chasing rumors from one end of the shattered city to the other. And then, one afternoon, he found them. They were living in a small room in a communal apartment on the outskirts of the city. Katya had aged enormously. The years of uncertainty, of not knowing whether her husband was alive or dead, had carved deep lines into her face and drained the light from her eyes. And Sonya was 10 years old now, no longer the little girl he had kissed on the forehead before walking out the door 4 years earlier. She was thin, quiet, wary in the way that children become wary when the world has shown them too much, too soon. When Aleksandr walked through the door, Katya looked at him as though she was seeing a ghost. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply stared at him, her hands trembling, her eyes filling with tears. And Sonya, little Sonya, who barely remembered his face, looked up at this stranger in the doorway and asked, in a small, uncertain voice, "Mama, who is that?" Aleksandr knelt down. He looked into his daughter's eyes, Katya's eyes, he now saw clearly, and he smiled. "I'm your papa," he said, "and I promised I would come back." He kept his promise. The story does not end neatly. It never does. For survivors of the Gulag. Aleksandr spent the rest of the war helping with the Soviet war effort, working as an engineer, rebuilding infrastructure, contributing to the defense of the nation that had imprisoned him. The irony of that was not lost on him. After the war ended, he rebuilt his life as best he could. He worked. He raised Sonya. He and Katya stayed together, though the years of separation had changed them both in ways that could never fully be undone. Aleksandr never spoke publicly about his time in the Gulag, not during Stalin's lifetime. That would have been suicide. And even after Stalin died in 1953 and the new Soviet leadership began a cautious, limited acknowledgement of the purges, Aleksandr remained silent. Some things, he believed, were not meant to be shared. Some wounds were too deep, too personal, too tied to a part of yourself that you had buried in order to survive. He carried those wounds with him for the rest of his life, and he was not alone. Millions of people passed through the Gulag system during the Soviet era. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 1918 and 1960, somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 million people died inside Soviet labor camps. Some estimates are significantly higher. These were not faceless statistics. They were individuals, each one with a name, a family, a life that was interrupted or destroyed by the machinery of the state. Many of their stories were never told. Many were deliberately buried, suppressed by the Soviet government, silenced by fear, lost to time. Aleksandr's story is one of the few that survived. So why does this matter? Why does a story from 80 years ago, from a political system that no longer exists, deserve your attention today? Because the Gulag was not an anomaly. It was not a freak accident of history. It was the product of a specific set of conditions: political authoritarianism, state paranoia, the dehumanization of individuals in the name of collective ideology. And those conditions are not unique to the Soviet Union. They have appeared before. They appear again, in different forms, in different places, in different eras. The Gulag reminds us what happens when a state decides that certain people are expendable, when human beings are reduced to numbers, when the machinery of power operates without accountability, without justice, and without mercy. It reminds us of the cost, and it reminds us, if we are paying attention, of what is at stake when we allow those conditions to take root. Aleksandr Volkov survived the Gulag because he refused to stop believing that his life had value, that his family mattered, that the future was worth fighting for, even when every piece of evidence around him suggested otherwise. That belief That stubborn, irrational, beautiful insistence on the worth of a single human life is not just a survival strategy. It is one of the most powerful forces in the world. Aleksandr Petrovich Volkov lived until 1979. He died quietly in his home in Leningrad at the age of 76. His daughter Sonia grew up to become a teacher. She raised her own children in the shadow of a history she only partially understood, because her father had never told her the full story of what had happened to him. It wasn't until after his death, when Sonia found a small leather notebook hidden among his possessions, filled with his own handwritten account of his years in the Gulag, that the full scope of his experience became known. That notebook is the basis for this story. And it is a testament to something that no political system, no matter how brutal, no matter how powerful, can ever fully destroy. The human will to survive. The human will to remember. The human will to bear witness. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, if it stayed with you even for a moment after you finish watching, then I need you to do something for me. Share this video. Not because I need the views, but because stories like this one deserve to be heard. Because the people who lived through this, who suffered, who fought, who survived, deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this one coming. Stories from the darkest chapters of human history. Stories that most people have never heard. Stories that matter. And if you have a moment, drop a comment below. Tell me what part of this story hit you the hardest. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what you're feeling. Because this is not just a video. This is a conversation, and I want to hear from you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering. Because that, more than anything, is how we honor the people who lived through the darkest moments of history. We remember them, we tell their stories, and we make sure the world never forgets.